The American public has had a long and storied relationship with drugs, sometimes exalting them and sometimes demonizing them. In this video, we're going to explore how the court of public opinion has influenced American drug policy and regulation, beginning with opium and then discussing LSD and crack cocaine. Has drug policy been the result of public opinion or an imposition of the state? Who in society, if anyone, has had a say in the matter? Opium was introduced to the United States by Chinese immigrants in the 1870s and was smoked in opium dens, primarily by immigrants and those of a lower social class. At the same time, adoption of morphine, the purified alkaloid from opium, was taking off as a medical treatment for the middle and upper classes. For those not predisposed to smoking opium that could not afford a doctor, patent medications laden with opium offered an avenue for consumption for working class Americans. As morphine addiction became more prevalent, public views on the matter differed depending on the route of administration. Opium smoking was a behavior associated with criminals, immigrants, and other societal undesirables that were seen as dangerous. Morphinism resulting from medical use was considered to be a kind of tragedy, with the middle and upper class white patients seen as victims in need of protection. Finally, patent medications were increasingly seen as unpredictable and dangerous concoctions by doctors and by legislators. This tapestry of opinions led to the Harrison Tax Act in 1914 and the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906. The Harrison Tax Act effectively outlawed the use of opium and morphine not prescribed by a doctor and was supported by physicians eager to avoid blame for morphinism. This was a clear victory for the public opinion of the middle and upper classes, which retained their access to morphine, while criminalizing other methods of consumption utilized by other groups that could not afford medical care. In this case, the government acted on the wishes of physicians and the predominantly white upper and middle classes of society. The other piece of related legislation at the time was the Pure Food and Drug Act, which was more widely beneficial and forced producers of medication to list their ingredients and to not adulterate their products. Support for this act was galvanized by reports from muckrakers such as Upton Sinclair, and the dawn of mass media allowed this journalism to reach the general public. This act did not criminalize any consumer behavior or restrict the ability of poor or working people to access medication. For most of society, this act was a desired change and a positive one. We will now jump forward significantly in time to April 19, 1943, which many of you will know as Bicycle Day, when Albert Hofmann, the creator of LSD, dosed himself with approximately 250 UG of the compound, and was first investigated for a variety of different psychiatric and military uses in the 1950s, but slowly began to spill over into wider society. Synthesis by non-pharmaceutical suppliers, such as the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, allowed for large quantities to be available to the general public. LSD soon became symbolic of the anti-war movement and represented the American counterculture. LSD evangelicists such as Timothy Leary sought to use LSD as a means to revolutionize society. Throughout the 1960s, the media began to lambast LSD as a dangerous drug, and the average American began to see LSD as a physically and morally hazardous compound. The Nixon administration had a particular vendetta against the compound and against Timothy Leary, setting LSD firmly in the crosshairs of the federal government. The result of this growing public and federal animosity was the Controlled Substances Act in 1970, which banned LSD and other classical psychedelics by making them Schedule I drugs without any known therapeutic use. This, however, was not the first legislation against LSD, and Congress actually banned LSD in 1966, with New York acting as early as 1965. This, combined with Sandoz withdrawal of its LSD from the U.S. market, effectively ended LSD research in the United States. While we today may not see LSD as a particularly dangerous, public opinion at the time was sharply aligned against it. While those in the countercultural and some researchers may have seen the therapeutic and/or recreational merits to LSD, most in the general public had come to believe it was very dangerous. It is difficult to say if Congress and the Nixon administration banned LSD because the public desired it, or because it was in the interest of the federal government. In this case, it seems the desires were well aligned, and even if the public was not responsible for the CSA, their opinion made it politically acceptable. In this case, the minority of those who found LSD medically or personally useful had their ability to utilize it taken away by the majority. As we discuss cocaine, we once again move forward in time, but also back to the Harrison Tax Act. Cocaine was banned with morphine in the Harrison Tax Act, in large part due to racialized fears about black men using cocaine and becoming violent or dangerous to the social order. Cocaine became a drug associated with affluent whites and was used sporadically as a topical anesthetic in dentistry. The introduction of freebase, or crack cocaine, in the 1980s would cause its popularity to skyrocket. Crack was much cheaper than typical powdered cocaine and became a commonly used drug amongst black Americans living in inner cities. The death of the basketball player Len Bias in 1986 from a cocaine overdose brought the epidemic to the public eye and incited moral panic. Media coverage of crack cocaine's dangers, combined with pre-existing prejudices against black Americans, led to significant negative public opinion regarding cocaine. Reagan and his anti-drug policy took significant issue with crack and sought to legislate against it. Cocaine was already scheduled and regulated, so the government couldn't simply prohibit sale and usage, as that had already been done. Legislation came in the form of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which put extremely strict and disproportionate minimum sentencing requirements on crack cocaine. The amount of crack cocaine required to receive a certain punishment was 1/100th that of powder cocaine. This led to extremely high rates of incarceration for black Americans compared to white ones, due in part to them being more likely to use crack instead of powder cocaine. The general public supported this due to moral panic and racialized fears. In this case, the public got what they desired, a crackdown on what they considered to be dangerous undesirables. The Reagan administration also got what it wanted, the advancement of their strict anti-drug policy. While the crack epidemic had ravaged the black community, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act was not in their best interest. It did not alleviate the drug epidemic in their communities and made their plight even worse through the burden of mass incarceration. This is another example of a scared majority public enforcing their will on the smaller minority of the country. As was the case with LSD, the goals of the federal government and the fears of the public overlap to the point where it is difficult to determine which party was responsible for the legislation that occurred. Now we've taken a very brief trip through the three famous drugs, what conclusions can we draw regarding the power of public opinion in U.S. drug policy? One trend seems to be that the more modern cases, LSD and crack cocaine, seem to closely track the desires of the general public at large, while the older case of morphine appears to be more pushed forward by the upper and middle classes. This seems to be related by mass media and television, as LSD and crack cocaine were both villainized in part due to constant negative TV and radio exposure. Not only do people in modern times have access to often biased information, they are typically bombarded with it. While mass outrage could be sparked through media in the late 19th and early 20th century, such as through the work of Upton Sinclair, the effect seems to be more pronounced from the 1970s on. At all points, drugs were associated with a group deemed dangerous: Chinese immigrants and poor whites, black Americans, and those in the countercultural and anti-war movements. In many ways, control of drugs seemed to be a proxy through which the majority culture could attempt to control groups they deemed dangerous. By pairing an unknown fear like a new drug with a known fear of a particular group, it became that much easier to turn public opinion and pass anti-drug legislation. At the end of the day, the public has had significant influence on drug policy outcomes. In the course of this research, there was no scenario where the government obviously acted against the public's will, or more specifically, the majority's will. This is important to remember moving forward as we seek decriminalization and medicalization of controlled substances. As important as the science and the ethics are, little will change unless the beliefs of the public can be swayed.